People who make arguments for the Department of Education aren't aware why the Department of Education was created in the first place, actually. So is that purpose still relevant? To make sure that from a federal perspective, states were not systematically disadvantaging black school districts over predominantly white ones. Ironically, it's funny how these things change with the bureaucracies that fail. They blow oak smoke to cover up for their own failures. Anymore. So they find new purposes instead, creating a lot more damage along the way. For a lot of these agencies, were many of them formed with a positive intention at the outset? Yes. In culture of when an institution has achieved its purpose, celebrate it.
What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to the Right Point of View YouTube channel with your favorite host, Ashley. And if I'm not your favorite yet, don't you worry. I'm working on it. But we're back with another reaction video. And this one is Vivek Ramaswamy, who I just love how he articulates himself. I just love when he explains things. He's someone I really like to listen to. And in this one, he does a breakdown of the issues with the Department of Education, why he thinks it's a good reason to completely abolish it. Trump has come out and said that he's going to be doing just that. And people are up in arms. People are like, wait, no, what are you talking about? So I think it's cool to listen to what Vivek has to say about it, how it began, why it's even around, and why it will actually be beneficial to get rid of it. So I will not hold you up any longer. Please do remember to like this video if you like this video, and remember to subscribe. I really do appreciate it, and it helps to spread the message as well. So thank you very much. Let's get right into this video. The video starts now.
I go back to this question of mission, right? A lot of people who make arguments for the Department of Education aren't aware why the Department of Education was created in the first place, actually. So that might be a useful place to start, is that this thing was created. It had a purpose, presumably. What was that purpose? Might be at least a relevant question to ask before we decide what are we doing with it or not. What was the purpose of this thing that we created? It's not it to me seems like a highly relevant question, yet in this discussion about government reform, it's interesting how eager people are to skip over that question and just to talk about, okay, but we got the status quo and it's just going to be disruptive, versus asking the question of, okay, this institution was created. It had an original purpose. Is that purpose still relevant? Is this organization at all fulfilling that purpose today? To me, those are some relevant questions to ask. So let's talk about that for the Department of Education. Its purpose was relevant at that time, which was to make sure that localities, and particularly states, were not siphoning dollars, taxpayer dollars, away from predominantly black school districts to predominantly white ones. And that was not a theoretical concern at the time. It was happening, or there was at least some evidence that that was happening in certain states in the South. And so you may say you don't like the federal solution. You may say you like the federal solution, but like it or not, that was the original purpose of the U.S. Department of Education, to make sure that from a federal perspective, states were not systematically disadvantaging black school districts over predominantly white ones. However noble and relevant that purpose may have been 6 decades ago, it's not a relevant purpose today. There's no evidence today of states intentionally mapping out which are the black versus white school districts and siphoning money in one direction versus another.
And that speaks to a lot of the departments, right? Like he said, 6 decades? Like, seriously? A lot of the government establishments or organizations are just laundering your money for other causes and calling it something else. You know what I mean? So I think it is an important question to ask, and why isn't anyone asking?
To the contrary, one of the things we've learned is that the school districts in the inner city, many of which are predominantly black, actually spend more money per student than other school districts for a worse result as measured by test scores and other performance on a per student basis, suggesting that there are other factors than the dollar expenditures per school determining student success, and actually suggesting that even the overfunding of some of those already poorly run schools rewards them for their actual bureaucratic failures. So against that backdrop, the Department of Education has instead extrapolated that original purpose of what was a racial equality purpose to instead implement a different vision of racial equity through the ideologies that they demand in the content of the curriculum that these public schools actually teach. So
now also think about that too. If we could, people want the inner city schools to be better. Like you said, for you give all of this money for actually a less of a result. They're not thriving. They're, the reading grade level is way below, and all of these types of things. Wouldn't it make more sense to abolish that department that no longer serves the purpose it was originally created for, and instead maybe think of something new they can use those funds for to create something that will make inner city children more successful, maybe empower them more, start, you know what I mean? Like dismantling funds just being given to something that doesn't even matter at this point, and instead using it for something that's a problem today. I think that's what should be advocated, especially for the Black community in inner cities. That's who it was created for.
Oh, Department of Education funding, so federal funding accounts for about, I'm giving you round numbers here, but around 10% of the funding of most public schools across the country. But that comes with strings attached. So in today's Department of Education, this didn't happen back in 1970, but it's happening today. Ironically, it's funny how these things change with the bureaucracies that fail. They blow oak smoke to cover up for their own failures. What happens with today's Department of Education? They effectively say you don't get that funding unless you adopt certain goals deemed at achieving racial or gender equity goals. And in fact, they also intervene in the curriculum where there's evidence of schools in the Midwest or in the Great Plains that have been denied funding because Department of Education funding, so long as they have certain subjects like archery. There was one instance of a school that had archery in its curriculum. I find that to be pretty interesting, actually. I think you have different kinds of physical education. This is one that combines mental focus with physical aptitude. But hey, maybe I'm biased. Doesn't matter whether you like archery or not. I don't think it's the federal government's job to withhold funding from a school because they include something in their curriculum that the federal government deems inappropriate, where that locality found that to be a relevant locus of education.
Exactly, because who knows their students and what's needed in that demographic the most? The states, the counties. But big governments get to say, okay, well, we control your funding. And if you want this funding, you're going to have to implement XYZ. Now, how is that productive? If we're telling you, the leaders of the people who are on the ground, if we're telling you this is actually what we need, and you're saying, no, I don't think so, it's not really necessary, this is necessary. It's another government overreach. Taking your money, controlling the education, but by abolishing it, Trump says it all the time, you're putting the power back in the parents' hands. Allow the states to determine what's needed and where funding should go. Why should this agency, this organization be able to do so when they're out of touch with what's even happening in any individual county? It's fraud, literally, just taking more of your money, blowing smoke, gaslighting you, and making you feel like, oh, we're doing this to have higher standards, but maybe your standards aren't the standards we need. You know what I mean?
So what you see then is an abandonment of the original purpose that's long past. You don't have this problem that the Department of Education was originally formed to solve of siphoning money from black school districts to white school districts and laundering that effectively in public funds. That doesn't exist anymore. So they find new purposes instead, creating a lot more damage along the way. So you asked me to steelman it, and could I say something constructive rather than just, pounding down on the other side? One way to think about this is, for a lot of these agencies, were many of them formed with a positive intention at the outset? Yes. Where that positive intention existed, I'm still a skeptic of creating bureaucracies, but if you're going to create one, at least make it, what should we call it? A task force. Make it a task force. A task force versus an agency means after it's done, you celebrate, you've done your work, pat yourself on the back, and then move on, rather than creating a standing bureaucracy, which actually finds things to do after it has already solved or addressed the first reason it was born in the first place.
Exactly. And that is exactly why it has to go. And new task force need to be established to see what are today's issues rather than keeping this department for, in which it was created for, you know what I mean? Which no longer exists. So I think it's completely common sense. And again, if we can reallocate the funding that they're getting, get rid of them because they're no longer required, and start dumping that cash flow into that capital into places that are now needed today. Total common sense. Drop a comment below if you understand what's going on, you agree. Because, the left is just up in arms about this. But again, it's Trump dismantling their filters for stealing taxpayer money, in my opinion.
And I think we don't have enough of that in our culture. Right? I mean, even if you have a company that's generated tons of cash flow and it solved a problem, let's say it's a biopharmaceutical company that developed a cure to some disease, and the only thing people knew at that company was how to develop a cure to that disease, and they generated a boatload of cash from doing it. At a certain point, you could just give it to your shareholders and close up shop. And that's actually a beautiful thing to do. You don't see that happen enough in the American consciousness and the American culture of when an institution has achieved its purpose, celebrate it and then move on. And I think that culture in our government would result in a vastly restrained scope of government rather than today. It's a one-way ratchet. Once you cause it to come into existence, you cause new things to come into existence, but the old one that came into existence continues to persist and exist as well. And that's where you get this metastasis over the last century.
So what kind of things do you think government should do that the private sector, the forces of capitalism, would create drastic inequalities or create the kind of pain we don't want to have in government?
So I would say that those are two central functions of government: is to preserve national boundaries and the national security of a homeland. And number two is to protect and preserve private property rights and the enforcement of those private property rights. And I think at that point, you've described about 80 to 90% of the proper role of a government.
What about infrastructure?
Look, I think that most infrastructure can be dealt with through the private sector.
And that's exactly it. Governments are supposed to be created to enforce law and order and manage budgets and things to continue to have the country thrive and its citizens. What state we're in with North America as a whole, or, probably globally actually, is government overreach. These people have, I think, forgotten they work for us. They work for us.
Broadly speaking, 80 to 90% of the goal of the federal government, I'm not going to say 100, 80 to 90% of the goal of the existence of a federal government should be of government period, should be to protect national boundaries and provide security for the people who live there and to protect the private property rights of the people who reside there. If we restore that, I think we're well on our way to a revival of what our founding fathers envisioned. And I think many of them would give you the same answer that I just did. So
exactly. Honestly, Vivek has just a very articulate way of explaining things in such a common sense fashion. I do appreciate his intelligence because when he came onto the trail, it was like fiery, and he took a strong right side stance on most of his views, and he was very welcome. Do you know what I mean? Because has common sense. He articulates it well. It makes sense. It lands well for the common listener. You know what I mean? So shout out Vivek Ramaswamy. I think he's going to be around a long time. I think it's time to get some fresh faces like his more into the threshold of what's going on, and they're on their way, man. They're on their way. So I hope that brings some clarity to some people who had concerns about what the Department of Education's role really was and what does it mean to abolish it. You know what I mean? And I think he laid out a really good point of why it was created originally. It no longer serves that purpose. And if we are going to have some type of system in place for that, it should be a task force and not be an agency or an organization that just has this long standing place there. Because as he said, once they've done what they're supposed to do, they're just going to continue to find other ways to find problems to keep taking the funding and then covering up all the shit they're not doing. You know what I mean? So Trump's cleaning up house, y'all. He's cleaning up house. I think everybody should be really excited. And I hope those of you who are still feeling some type of way about Trump's victory, I hope y'all come around. Be open-minded, do some research. Don't just shut it down. Be open for change because obviously Americans want it. They want change. and they deserve it. Canada too. Shout out Canada. I hope they get rid of Trudeau and move on, but that's for another video. Anyway, like this video, please comment, subscribe. Love to hear from you guys. Your guys' support is always appreciated. You guys just mind blow me every time I post. I'm just like so heartwarmed, and if y'all are still watching this, just letting you know you're the true one. And drop a comment if you are still watching this at this point. I want to know who you are, and the fact that you're still listening to me just yammer on. Bless your heart. Anyways, I'll let you go, and until next time, see ya.